So the National Museum of the United States Army is under construction, and it'll be open to the public in the next 2 years. It tells the sort of birth of a nation to today's Army. The artifacts in our collection tell that story in different ways, and within those artifacts, the ones directly related to the African American experience, and it tells their story, but which is also part of the Army's story. So here we have a copy of an enlistment letter between Joseph Nye, who's a slave owner, and the Continental Army, allowing his slave, Juba, or Jack as he's referred to in this letter, to serve in the Continental Army for 5 months. However, his pay that Juba would receive from the Army, half his pay would have to go back to the slave owner. So this was a typical sort of agreement during the Revolutionary War, to allow slaves who wanted to fight in the Continental Army. This type of agreement was made. So it's dated July 14th, 1780. And we don't know too much about Juba, but we do know that he did gain his freedom after the war. So we hope to think that his service in the Continental Army allowed him to gain that freedom during that time. So another fascinating artifact in our collection, this time talks about the Civil War, about the achievements of African Americans during the Civil War. This is a colored troop medal, the earliest medal sort of honoring the achievements of African Americans during the Civil War. It was authorized by Major General Benjamin Butler. Butler was more of a politician than a fighting general. He was a lawyer and a big advocate for freeing the slaves. And so he wanted something to symbolize their sacrifice during the Civil War. So this medal, as you see, is two soldiers in formation, and a motto, their freedom will be gained by the sword. And on the other side, it states the year that this particular medal was cast in 1864, so later in the war. But General Butler, more of his famous decisions or acts was the contraband of war decision. So what he did when 3 slaves escaped to Fort Monroe, which is in Virginia, he declared them contrabands of war. He did that to protect them from the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave owners to sort of reclaim their property back if they escaped. So by declaring them contrabands, nullified that Fugitive Slave Act. And then once word spread about this decision, hundreds and then thousands of escaped slaves come to Fort Monroe. And Fort Monroe becomes known as Freedom Fort. So this medal sort of symbolizes, that fighting spirit, right? The fighting for freedom that African Americans, volunteered to do, initially was given to 200 African American soldiers during the war, and then thousands more after the war. So another item from the Civil War is a presentation snare drum that was dedicated to Henry Galloway, as you can see inscribed into the brass plate of this drum. Now, drums during the Civil War were used often in marching troops and communication on the battlefield, and so this sort of represents that from that time period. And what's interesting is his fellow soldiers of the 55th, paid for this drum as well as other instruments for the band that represented the 55th. And it's a beautiful piece. If you look at it, that brass sort of collar around the drum and the original sort of leather holders here gives sort of intimate details about how these things were built, but also a strong connection to a particular soldier from the 55th, African American soldier, who served during the Civil War and served in some key battles. For example, the Battle of Honey Hill, which was part of Sherman's famous March to the Sea, where many African American soldiers died during that battle. So it's kind of a symbol of their accomplishments, a symbol of their sort of fighting spirit during the Civil War.